Okay, I am now calling the November 12th, 2025 Beautification and Environmental Advisory Workshop meeting to order. Please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, state, republic, one nation, God, liberty, justice for all. Okay, Irene, will you please do a roll call?
Bruce Jones.
Here?
Susan Anderson. Because this is a workshop, we're going to continue with 2 out of the 5 members.
Okay, I'd like to introduce Dylan Rodriguez. You know him from previous presentations. And Jordan Myers, who's a longtime environmental expert working for the city. And I'm going to do a presentation on proposed amendments to Chapter 10, Environmental and Cultural Resource Protection of the Land Development Code. So with that, turn it over to Dylan.
Thank you, Richard. So like Richard said, we're going through the rewrite of the Land Development Code. Today we're going to look over Chapter 10, which is Environmental and Cultural Resource Protection. All these amendments, same as last time, fall under these 4 categories. Recent updates to the comprehensive plan clarify the intent of regulations, update references, or address ongoing / repetitive. That being said, we enter our first set of amendments. So this first amendment is 100101. This is in regards to the wetlands, and we are changing, we're switching from systems to corridors to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. Because wetland systems are important, and that is the intent of this chapter. We're really looking at the bigger system of it, or the corridors that run. We're looking at ramps, things like that. So it's an effort to be more encompassing. That makes
Can we ask questions?
Yeah.
Want to hope that, how do you define a corridor?
corridor. So that's going to be essentially a conservation corridor is what we're looking at. It's large areas, typically 10 acres or greater, of high-quality wetland systems, and including the upland buffer.
So you couldn't have a storm drainage system ditch, if you will, that's got a forest buffer on it, connecting 2 wetlands as a corridor?
No, not typically, because we go by UMAM scores, and typically a drainage ditch does not score high enough UMAM score. For a high-quality wetland, which is what we're looking for in these wetland corridors, we're looking at a 0.71 or higher. A drainage ditch is typically not well naturally vegetated, not in natural conditions. They don't score nearly high enough.
Right, but some corridors actually will, because of the nature, will bump up the quality of the wetlands themselves. And I'm just wondering if that gets figured into it, because I've seen around going around the community some areas where you have drainage ditches that are actually have a 50 to 100 foot buffer on it, and they're forested. And you see a lot of animals, plants that are in those, and they connect wetland systems. And I'm just wondering, because I mean, having corridors are really important. I'm just wondering whether that ever gets figured into this, because when you actually map it out, you might be able to see where that is. So.
Yep, and that definitely makes sense. I believe that's going to be the next step in the technical manual, essentially establishing a map of what we're designating as wetland corridors. And that'll look through all sorts of aspects, a lot of wildlife as well.
So I'm assuming there's a wetland GIS coverage that's up on the city and county system? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So 100102C, we added language for no stump removal or soil disturbance as far as clearing with hand tools. This is an important thing, mainly because there was some residents, people tried to use this as a way to go into the natural upland buffer and disturb it at times, try to justify it under this aspect. I feel by adding the no stump removal or soil disturbance, which is also recommended by a consultant reviewing this, that adds a good point of clarity of what that line looks like. So it's essentially to go in there and remove invasive species, things like that, not necessarily to do groundwork prep for area. Okay. We're gonna move on. Another exemption is 100102F, and that is just to update to reference in the Florida statute, chapter 62-330.05 on Florida. Then as amended, that way whenever it is updated, we don't have to go back through a code change. We know to follow most up-to-date. 100103A, the methodology for determining wetlands. We switched from identified to delineated because that's the process you go through it, the wetland delineation when identifying wetlands, as well as we did a code or update to reference chapter 62-340 of the Florida Administrative Code. Florida Administrative Code was in there before, but we didn't specify the chapter. That's a good point of clarity. I think it adds a little bit more information to this. Ten 0103C, all work within the city has to be done by a qualified environmental professional when preparing these reports. There is no such thing as a Florida qualified environmental professional, so we went ahead and removed the Florida aspect. It is more or less a local municipality certification. I'm sorry?
Who would these people be, the qualified?
They'd be, typically they're consultants that go through. We just require a certain amount of reports to be provided so they have demonstrated the level of expertise for when performing. So it essentially makes sure that we don't have somebody who is not very well versed in environmental aspects coming in providing us these reports. So I think it adds a lot of benefit when development happens. We have conscious consultants working on projects and the work is being done properly.
Dylan, is there a process for becoming a qualified?
Yes, sir. Yeah, it's in the technical manual. You have to. There's 3 aspects you can become qualified in. It is listed species, wetland delineation, as well as authorized agent. But that's really the certification you provide to us through FWC. It's a way for us to track who's doing the work and who has that certification in the city. The wildlife and the wetland delineation requirement of 5 reports with criteria within those reports being broken down. You have to provide, such as habitat assessment or permitting for listed species and wetlands and habitat mapping. There's a few other aspects.
Can you just elaborate who they submit resumes or who they submit them to and who decides upon who made it as a certified?
So I personally review that. That is a process where we require we ask for college degrees as well as reports that they've been able to produce, any other certifications they may have, if they've gone through taking any classes and things like that. And that's all evaluated in that criteria. Right. In table 10-1, footnote 1, wetland impacts regulated by St. Johns River Water Management District, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. And this part is added in Army Corps engineers. And that's an update to reference agencies. There was previously the authority of the 404 permits was directed to the Army Corps of Engineers from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, as well as their WOTUS, Waters of the United States, that are regulated by the Army Corps of Engineers permitting aspect. So it's really just making sure that all those agencies that review the different criteria are included. This is another new section, 100106H, something that's been added. A report must be completed within 3 years of submittal, or must have a valid formal wetland determination through appropriate agency. An updated delineation report can be requested if the site has been altered since the delineation in such ways, such as but not limited to clearing or altered water flow. And this is something I added just to prevent somebody from trying to use a report that may be 10 years old on a site, and there's been changes to the site, as well as the requirement for an updated one if sites have changed. I've seen that personally where you'll have a site that is heavily vegetated. They'll go through, clear cut the site for things such as silviculture, and that prior line doesn't quite hold up as well within a year or two because a lot of that vegetation that was retaining the water and kind of limiting the flow as well is not there. So it actually moves that line.
It's wet.
Yes, ma'am. That it does. Yep, so we have 3 years. Then the valid formal wetland determination, that's a 5-year it secures a line for 5 years, assuming no major site constraints happen. And that is a process that is permitted through St. John's River Water Management District or the Florida Department of Environment. So 100107, it's permitted activities and requirements. The biggest change here is just adding the Army Corps of Engineers, as they are a regulatory agency for wetlands as well. Ten oh one oh eight two, upland buffers adjacent to wetlands shall not be altered except as exempt by subsection 100102. Wetland buffers shall be protected from erosion and sediment during construction activities. And this language from here on is the new language. By installing silt fences or turbidity barriers 1 foot landward from upland buffers or permitted wetland impact. Double row silt fence spaced at least 3 feet apart shall be installed on any upland buffer or wetland that falls under the categories below. And category A is protected by conservation flume or preservation zoning. B is within a conservation easement, and C, high quality wetland as determined by 100105. And this is a current practice we do right now. We didn't have it codified in the code, but it is a best practice to do. So by adding it in the code, we add some teeth and basically force the requirement. And the goal here is to protect those high quality areas, those protected areas, by having that silt fence 1 foot above. That way, the siltation, they're not installing silt fence in the upland buffer. The double row as well helps protect us from, if one silt fence were to fall, wouldn't, essentially the second leg would be there to catch it, help protect, and hopefully give us enough time to notice that it's down, rectify that.
So are there penalties for people who don't? Just curious.
So yes and no. I do believe we have the ability to stop work order if it's impacting the wetland, which I believe is actually coming up in a second. So we have modified the activities permitted within a buffer. Activities or construction which does not have an adverse effect on natural functions or of the wetland buffer may be permitted within the buffer. The activities or constructions included, but are not limited to, pruning, planting of suitable native vegetation, removal of exotic and nuisance plant species, construction of minor drainage structures such as outfall pipes and outfall structures, and we have removed or bermed construction of boardwalks, docks, piers, passive recreation such as at-grade, pervious hiking. We did remove berms because we've seen that issue occur where they try to essentially put a berm all the way through the upland buffer if it's along a stormwater pond, and it kind of defeats the purpose at that point of having an upland buffer in that area not being permitted impact. So we feel that by outfall pipes and outfall structures, it's fairly limited, and they already have to permit secondary impacts or primary impacts when installing these, as well as the inclusion of such as and removing or at-grade pervious hiking trails. We want to make sure those hiking trails are pervious. That is consistent with St. John's River Water Management District or what they allow upland buffer. They do not allow pervious or impervious trails unless it's permitted. So. In 100109, this is the area where we get into essentially what happens if an upland buffer or a wetland has been impacted. And that's unpermitted impacts to wetlands or upland buffers during construction without appropriate wetland permit. In the absence of an appropriate wetland permit or permits, development-related activities shall not cause the diminishing of quality or destruction of wetlands in contravention of applicable federal, state laws, rules, or regulations. Should wetlands exist on the subject site, all development activities that might negatively affect the wetlands shall cease. Application shall notify the city, FDEP, St. John's River Water Management District, and Army Corps of Engineers to the extent required by law if wetlands are determined to be on site. Property shall be developed in full compliance with all applicable laws, rules, regulations. Upland buffers and wetlands shall be maintained in their natural vegetative condition. Native vegetation removed or destroyed within the upland buffers or wetlands in violation of this code shall be restored. These areas shall be replanted with comparable native vegetation species such as were removed.
What is an upland buffer? How does that differ? Is that like a hammock or some kind of elevated surface? What would that
So,
be?
an upland buffer essentially is, here in the city, we require 25 feet, 15-foot minimum, 25-foot average, 15-foot minimum along all wetland systems. And then for high-quality wetland systems, we're actually looking at 50 feet and 50-foot average with a 25-foot minimum. So it's not necessarily defined as one habitat type, even one vegetative community. Instead, it is anything that is not a wetland, that is remain natural.
Yeah, would it be good to define that a little bit better? I mean,
Upland buffer?
yeah.
Yes, sir. Yeah, it's in the code previously. Do you have that binder?
Maybe it's already in there somewhere, but
Yeah, so I did only present the changes right now. We do have upland buffer defined here. Natural upland buffer with an average. Yeah, I mean, I could definitely go through and re-evaluate natural upland
or
buffers,
you could just say
but it's
everything.
also probably in the glossary. Yeah.
Like you said, anything that's not a wetland.
Yeah,
It's a buffer for one.
It's usually in the transitional area.
Yeah.
It goes from the wetland to the upland. So it's kind of half wetland, half upland. It's usually that transition space in between the two.
and there,
It may be in the glossary.
Yeah.
Just capture something.
and there is requirements for it to be naturally vegetated with the existing vegetation, right? So essentially, it is undisturbed to protect the quality of the wetland. But I will definitely look in the glossary and make sure it's defined. If not, I will find it. So 10.0207A.1, we actually get into the floodplain aspect of this code now, and I'll read over it. I guess have any questions? So delineation of flood hazard areas, floodway boundaries, 25-foot floodway setbacks, flood zones, base flood elevation, and ground elevation. We removed if necessary for review of the proposed development. Currently, the city, if you have any zone A, or I guess AE has a flood elevation established, but you're also providing that at the time. But flood zone A essentially has no base flood elevation, I apologize, base flood elevation established on the site, and we always require them to find that through a study. There have been times where, I think Jordy, this too, where a developer tries to stay out of that zone A, but it's not a true definition of where the flood zone lies. It instead is a educated guess at that point. So they try to exercise this section of code to get around doing the study instead of putting in the work, determining exactly where that flood elevation is supposed to be, and working to mitigate.
And this was always adjusted to change your flood lines.
Yep. All right. 10.02.12A, minimum requirements, subdivision proposals, including proposals for manufactured home parks and subdivisions, shall be reviewed to determine that, 1, such proposals are consistent with the need to minimize flood damage and will be reasonably safe from flooding. 2, all public utilities and facilities such as sewer, gas, electric, communications, and water systems are located and constructed to minimize or eliminate flood damage. And 3, adequate drainage is provided to reduce exposure to flood hazard areas in zones AH. Adequate drainage paths shall be provided to guide floodwaters around and away from proposed structures. And we added section 4 and 5, where we have a requirement for 2 feet of freeboard above established flood elevations. And 5, all new platted lots shall not be located within any special flood hazard area.
Dylan, could you elaborate on definitions of zone AH and AO?
I'll leave that to Jordan.
So AH and AO are actually shallow flooding areas and riverine flooding. We actually don't have any AH or AO zones in the city. The only zones that we have are A, AE, X shaded, or the 0.2% chance. and Zone X. We also don't have any B zones or BE zones. Those are beachside wave action. So those zones are just in there in case FEMA ever decides to change our flood zones and add AH or AO into the city, but currently we do not.
We will continue. 100212G, limitations on sites in coastal high hazard areas, Zone B and AE, coastal high hazard areas. Alterations of sand dunes and mangroves, sand shall not be permitted. Construction or restoration of dunes under or around elevated buildings and structures shall comply with section 100217I of this article. Then 0217, add grade accessory structures for properties located in special flood hazard. At grades, accessory structures are permitted provided the accessory structures are used only for parking or storage. And if located in a special flood hazard area, Zone A, AE, other than coastal high hazard areas, are 1 story and not larger than 600 square feet and have flood openings in accordance with section R332 of the Florida Building Code. 2, if located in coastal high hazard areas, Zone B/BE, are located below elevated buildings that are not larger than 100 square feet. 3, are anchored to resist flotation, collapse, or lateral movement resulting from flood loads. 4, have flood damage resistant materials used below the base flood elevation plus 2 feet. And 5, have mechanical, plumbing, and electrical systems, including plumbing fixtures, elevated to or above the base flood elevation plus 2 feet. And this is not to regulate all at-grade accessory structures. This is meant to only regulate in that flood area. So. And 0218, general requirements for other development. All developments, including man-made changes to improve or unimproved real estate for which specific provisions are not specified in this article, Florida Building Code shall 1, be located and constructed to minimize flood damage. 2, meet limitations of section 100213E of this article, located in a regulatory flooded way. 3, be anchored to prevent flotation, collapse, and lateral movement resulting from hydrostatic loads, including the effect of buoyancy during conditions of the design flood. 4, be constructed of flood damage resistant material. 5, have mechanical, plumbing, and electrical systems above the design floor, flood elevation, or meet requirements of ASCE 24, except that minimum electrical service required to address life safety and electrical code requirements is permitted below the design flood elevation, provided it conforms to the provisions of the electrical part building code for wet locations. And we added 6, system is designed to provide 2 feet freeboard above base flood.
Just an English thing. You've got everything else starting with a verb. So you maybe want to say be designed or something like that. Be, have.
Yeah, I can modify it. Yes, ma'am.
Confuse me when that system.
Yes,
That's a
ma'am.
good point.
I believe this language came from FEMA, so fortunately it was a copy and paste. That's a misread on my part.
Back on the write-up of this, I learned a new word, frangible.
Frangible. So
I do want to ask you a question, because that was in the write-up.
Yeah.
Maybe it's further on. It was something about a cement, maybe it's further on. That's not here, okay.
No problem. 100305B. This subsection is actually for wellhead protection zones. A lot of it is in compliance currently with state statutes. At least we go above and beyond, especially with our primary wellhead protection zone, which this section actually covers. The 2 aspects we are adding to it is that no new retention or detention facilities, including but not limited to stormwater treatment facilities, are permitted within that 500-foot wellhead setback zone, and a renumbering because we added a section. And B for that is Florida Department of Transportation standard type D and or equivalent raised curb. And the intention of this is to prevent any kind of pollutants that may go into that detention retention area. Typically that's a stormwater system, from entering, basically from contaminating our well site. And/or equivalent for type B raised curb, it's a 6-inch high curb, but there are some other curbs that are even greater than that and be asked for equivalent.
Can I ask a question about wellhead protection? You kind of went from that to that.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there's a requirement on that 500-foot buffer that's around it for any type of land cover. So in other words, if you're a protected area, is it going to be grass? Is it going to be forested? What is it going to be? And then I also noticed there's an exemption for agriculture, which I find strange because that's a source of pollution, definitely pesticides, herbicides. And then if you have livestock, you're going to get nutrient input to the system and potentially fecal coliforms and so forth. So
Same with the silviculture, same with the pine plantations, herbicides, and don't we have some wells in some of the lumber areas?
I'm just wondering whether there's any requirement there or that it's just more for safety so somebody doesn't bust in and do something to the well. I mean,
So that is a good point. I can look into that, what the Florida statute says about it. There is more than likely, if I had to take an educated guess, an exemption for it. I don't know if we can regulate if there is already a built-in exemption, but it is something I will explore.
Best practices for agriculture.
Yeah, exactly,
know,
exactly.
Using it only when needed or,
Yep. We see that throughout all environment, Florida.
I mean, aren't we looking for more wells or more sources of water? Aren't we getting a little more water here? No.
And to answer your question about ground cover, we currently do not have a requirement built into this code for what kind of ground cover it is. But we do have built in here that is, if it's any impervious area, it has to essentially be funneled outside where the stormwater facility is. So everything has to be collected, conveyed outside 500. 500 feet. It's a primary wellhead. All right. So then we'll move on to,
I have another question.
yeah.
What is the underground injection control wells? Is that what that is?
I believe that is a type. If I'm remembering it correctly, I believe it is essentially pumping excess water or different things like that from different forms into the ground to get rid of it. Not something we see very much here. I believe it can be used for stormwater and things like that. Or industrial wastewater can be sent down, but that's not something,
So it's not done here, you know?
not in this area. So we'll move on to 10.04.03.4, which is our listed species section. The property owner shall be responsible for relocating gopher tortoises on site or other suitable locations as approved by Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission and providing an approved after-action report prior to any clearing activity. This clarification comes from current practice. We like to see the approved after-action reports that shows they did the work, not just that they pulled a permit and that they're never performing that work. We may not regulate the relocation of gopher tortoises because FFWCC has the authority over that. But we can definitely be a good partner, make sure that they have after-action reports stating that they've done the work, that FWC is happy before we allow them. Listed species protection during construction activities, proper protection to the satisfaction of all agencies with jurisdiction over the matter shall be provided. Where appropriate, the city shall require a preliminary gopher tortoise survey for existing single-family platted lots prior to the initiation of construction activity. Preliminary gopher tortoise survey shall be conducted by qualified environmental professionals, and results of said survey shall be submitted to the city for review. Should gopher tortoises be present on the subject property, a permit and after-action report shall be submitted to the city prior to the commencement of any ground disturbance activities. Gopher tortoise shall be relocated to suitable habitats in accordance with FFWC's permit. And this section focuses mainly on single-family lots as well, where, like the ICT platted lots when they're located.
So, what do you do about indigo snakes?
Indigo snakes?
Because they're hard to find, and they're in tortoise burrows in many places.
Yes, sir.
How would you do, is it just, if you happen to come by one, you have to relocate it, or, because it's a take problem, right?
Yes, sir.
And if you run one over with a bulldozer, right, you've got a problem. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, of course. So there is actually an indigo plan that's required on certain construction sites, especially whenever there's gopher tortoises there or present, because they do utilize those burrows so much. So technically, the process is that if you see an indigo snake on the site, you're supposed to stop work, give it ample time for it to leave. Once it leaves the area, you're able to resume.
And if you run over one, do you have to report it? And are you exempt?
I don't know if you're exempt. I imagine not.
Because that's considered a take if you kill one, so.
Yes, sir.
And it is a listed species, so.
That is correct. Indigo snake? I would like to say yes, but I believe FWC
Big
also
home
has,
ranges, yeah.
they do release it.
Yeah. I'm just curious to know what,
Yeah.
and I can remember, but plants are also part of the Endangered Species Act, and I'm wondering if there are any, wetlands often have vernal-type plants, and wondering if there are any of those, and are they required to kind of look for those as well and flag them, and then relocate them?
So we defer to essentially the state and federal guideline. Whatever their species management plan has requirements for, follow. So if there is a relocation process, we make it. Now, first, unfortunately for listed plant species or endangered plants, don't know any requirements. A lot of times what happens there is it's acquisition of conservation that has that species on there, trying to keep the species thriving. I don't know of any situation where relocation of this.
In some cases, depending on the size of the property, people, when they do the clearance, they actually go out and flag them, so they know where they are, and then they can relocate them.
I know that the Florida Native Plant Society will go out and move plants,
Yep.
but, somebody has to let them know.
Yep.
And give them permission.
Yeah, they do have both federal and state protection.
In 100405, 100405 wildlife crossings, in areas of wildlife corridors where the project proposes fragmentation of habitat or conservation corridors, site plan shall include dedicated wildlife crossings to minimize ecological impacts and preserve natural movement of wildlife. And this is something that's supported by our comprehensive plans, chapter 6, section 1.13.7. And the real goal of this is to make sure that if we're bifurcating any kind of significant habitat or high-quality wetland systems or anything like that, we have an established wildlife crossing, and that we have teeth to make them do it as well in this.
So is there a GIS coverage that you guys have with corridors that would allow the people that are developing to know whether they're violating that or not?
So we're going to define it in the glossary as well as we are produce a map. We're going to look at habitat, conservation, existing conservation, and potentially Florida wildlife corridor. Yep.
So you guys actually have a GIS data layer that actually shows corridors and where the property is, because you'll have a property boundary and all that?
Yep, we're going to build that out.
That, right, but then again, it depends on how you define a corridor. So, and for what?
What's the wildlife?
Well, but there are different wildlife species, and they all use corridors in a different way. corridors can sometimes be a bad thing. Like, the problem with the big Florida corridor is that you've got the Key Largo wood rat that's highly endangered, and it's on the bottom of the corridor, and you've got, unfortunately, you have pythons that have figured it out, and they're having to trap it on the corridor. And if one of those pythons gets into that community, that's the end of the
Yes.
wood rat, so. Other things move on it, pests and so forth. Diseases, spread that way too, so.
And we'll move on to section 10.05.01. 10.05 is actually our cultural resource assessment, or cultural resource protection chapter. Sorry. Purpose and intent. The purpose of this section is to protect and manage the significant historic and archaeological resources of the city of Palm Coast to the maximum extent feasible by providing procedures for the review of plans and development projects, as well as maintain standards for the protection and management of these important resources. So we just added words in there, or we added portions in there for clarification. 10.05.02, lands not subject to cultural resource survey. A cultural resource field survey and assessment is not required for a parcel that have undergone a cultural resource investigation. We add within 5 years from the time of application. And the assessment concluded that the land does not contain cultural resources that are considered by the Florida Department of Historic Resource and Preservation Office to be significant or potentially significant. A copy of correspondence from the State Historic Preservation Office shall be submitted to the city, verifying the subject property does not contain significant or potentially significant cultural resources. And we worked with an archaeologist to come up with this 5 years. He felt it was applicable for the most part. He did mention that some surveys are more in-depth than others, so that flexibility may be built in here. But there are also surveys that are not quite as in-depth. So we definitely want to make sure that we set essentially a time frame and an expiration on those reports, because as time goes on, we discover more things as well. You may survey a site one time, you dig test pits, you look at the master site file, but new data can come around anytime, basically saying that there is something located at the site. And we do see that throughout Florida as well, such as the city of St. Augustine, I believe, is currently going through an excavation of an old, I don't remember what exactly it was, but I believe it's a smaller fort at the time that I believe the British were stationed at, tore down, goes for development. So there's always things to be discovered. Right? 10.05.03, land subject to cultural resource assessment, survey, and other archaeological investigations. A Phase 1 cultural resource investigation shall be accomplished before the issuance of a development order or a permit prior to the commencement of construction activities or any other physical impact or disturbance of that land. So we switched the language from investigation to assessments. That's kind of the current verbiage used within that community. And as well as we added and other archaeological investigations, because sometimes there is a requirement for essentially like a Phase 3 where they go in and they actually excavate the site for any kind of remains or archaeological artifacts they can find. 10.05.03, continue. Takes place within a parcel that has been previously surveyed for cultural resources. Takes place within a parcel contains a site that is listed in the Florida Master Site File as eligible or potentially eligible for listing in the National Registry of Historical Places, criteria by which site significance is measured, or in the City of Palm Coast Protected Site Inventory, thus requiring further investigation. Takes place within a recently discovered site deemed significant by the NHRP criteria that has not yet been recorded to the Florida Master Site File or listed in the City of Palm Coast Protected Site File. Takes place on a parcel that has been determined to possibly contain a potential site that can be listed in the Florida Master Site File as determined by the Land Use Administrator. If the results of the survey investigation are deemed unsatisfactory by the city staff, the city may require, at the applicant's expense, an additional cultural resource investigation. from another cultural resource professional. And the goal of this is to enhance where we're getting these surveys. We're hoping the quality as well, and the ability that if we are unhappy with the quality of the survey, we can ask to perform another one from a different archaeologist so that we can get the best results. And 0504, professional qualifications and cultural resource assessment survey requirements. Professional qualification, cultural resource professionals are certified archaeologists that meet the qualifications in the Secretary of the Interior's Historic Preservation Professional Qualification Standards. B, cultural resource assessment surveys and cultural resource assessment surveys related reports shall follow the guidelines of the Florida Division of Historic Resources, Department of State, guidelines for cultural resource assessment archaeological investigations outlined Florida Division of Historic Resource Module 3 as amended shall be followed. Reporting the CRAS survey shall follow DHR Chapter 1A-46 Archaeological and Historic Report Standards and Guidelines as amended and the requirements of all applicable Florida statutes. So this lays a clear line of qualification and as well as report guidelines, for lack of a better word. And the as amended allows us to update that without having to go through and do a formal code. In 0504, the SHPO review the reference project in accordance with Chapter 267 and 373 Florida statute in implementing state regulations for possible effects on historic properties listed or eligible for listing in the National Registry of Historic Places or otherwise historical, architectural, and archaeological value prior to the issuance of a development order or permit or prior to the commencement of construction activities. A copy of the survey clearance letter issued by the Compliance Review Section of the Division of Historic Resources or other documentation of authorized by the State Historic Preservation Office shall be submitted to the city. Management recommendations regarding this protection, preservation, or mitigation of impacts of the historic and archaeological site in concurrence with the Division of Historic Resources should be followed. In addition, copies of the Florida Master Site File forms generated during the Cultural Resource Assessment Study for the Division of Historical Resources shall be submitted to the city prior to their report. Continued, all Florida Master Site File forms generated in the City of Palm Coast LDC permit requirements, cultural resource assessment surveys, or any other type of archaeological work shall be submitted to the Florida Master Site File, Division of Historic Resources by a COPC official within Parks and Recreation Department or the Planning Division. In some cases, to be determined by COPC officials, an initial site investigation may be utilized to determine cultural resource site probability for lands requiring cultural resource investigation as approved by a certified archaeologist utilizing necessary criteria in accordance with state law to determine the cultural resource site probability. Study criteria include, but are not limited to, Florida Master Site File, historical information such as maps, soil types, land elevation, proximity of subject property to freshwater drainages such as rivers, creeks, coastal estuaries, intercoastal waterway, and substance-related natural resources. The following may substitute for a cultural resource assessment, survey, and assessment if certified RPA, registered professional archaeologist, certified professional archaeologist in writing to the land use administrator. Determination that the subject property has low probability of yielding cultural resources. A determination that proposed development activities will have no effect on cultural resource listed or eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. A determination that proposed development activities will have no effect on cultural resource values under federal and state requirements. And 0505. Protect properties containing potential and significant cultural resource sites. If a property proposed for development contains potential significant or significant cultural resource in areas proposed for development, the city shall adhere to the recommendations of the State Historic Preservation Office and shall require the applicant to do one or more of the following prior to the issuance of a development order or permit. A, preserve cultural resource within open space of the proposed development. B, redesign the development to accommodate preservation of all or all or a portion of the site containing the cultural resource, such as but not limited to environmental setbacks, conservation easements, pocket parks, or conservation lands. And C, the property owner may voluntarily fund or seek funding for Phase 3 mitigative excavation data extraction of the source if agreed by the Florida Division of Historic Resources / the State Historic Preservation Office. Ten oh five oh six, there is no changes on this section, it's just of decent length. I feel it's important to give section A for the continuance. Fortuitous fines and unmarked human burials. The following requirements apply to all building, construction, or alterations of land alteration activity. A, evidence of the existence of cultural resources. If evidence of the existence of cultural resources discovered or observed at development site or during development activities after final approval, permits, or issuance of development orders, all work shall cease in the area of effect. So, quick. The developer, owner, contractor, or agent thereof shall immediately notify professional archaeologists in the city. Examples of such evidence include whole or fragments of stone tools, shell tools, indigenous or historic pottery, bone tools, historic structures, foundations, burial mounds, shell mittens, sand mounds, or other types of prehistoric mounded architecture. Professional archaeologists selected and hired by the applicant shall assess the significance of the finds and, if warranted, notify the Florida Division of Historic Resources / the State Historic Preservation Office. In accordance with federal and state requirements, a report or letter shall be submitted to the city from a professional archaeologist and, if warranted, a copy of clearance letter from the State Historic Preservation Officer indicating that the proposed development will have no effect on cultural resource listed or eligible for listing in the National Registry of Historic Places or otherwise of historic, architectural, or archaeological. In subsection B, discover of human skeletal remains in accordance with the Florida statute. If any human skeletal remains or unmarked burials is discovered other than during cultural resource excavation authorized by the state or educational institution, all activities that may disturb the unmarked human burial shall cease immediately, and the district medical examiner shall be notified. Such activities shall not resume unless specifically authorized by the district medical examiner or the state archaeologist. In the event of unmarked human remains are encountered during permitted activities, all work shall stop immediately, and the proper authorities notified in accordance with section 872.05 Florida statute. During archaeological investigations, if the site is determined to contain unmarked burial and or human skeletal remains, if produced, these will be brought to the attention of the district medical examiner. If it was determined that the burials represent an individual or individuals who have been dead less than 75 years, or to the attention of the state archaeological. In the case, the remains were determined to be older than 75 years. The site is determined to be a prehistoric indigenous site. All work will be done in coordination with the state archaeologists, Florida Division of Historic Resources, who will make a final determination of adverse effects throughout the authority, the respective jurisdiction as defined in the Florida statute. Procedures outlined in the chapter 872.05 Florida statute will be followed regarding site mitigation and reporting this throughout the authority and direction of the state archaeologist. And if necessary, the district medical examiner, in some cases, the State Historic Preservation Office will make the determination to seek consultation and review comments by the Tribal Historical Preservation Office and the Seminole Tribe.
I don't have a question. How do they make the determination as to whether or not the bones are 75 years old?
Yeah, that's a great question. A medical examiner can figure that out, or a state archaeologist.
They use carbon dating or?
I don't know. I imagine it would be carbon dating, but I don't know what methods they use. All right. Any questions or feedback on the cultural resource section? There was a lot.
Yeah, those are good changes.
I agree. All right. For the next steps, additional questions or proposed amendments? I know we've kind of touched base on some questions throughout this presentation, some things to look into. I'll do that on my aspect, separate from this meeting as well. Is there anything else we would like to discuss, any of these changes or amendments?
I have some questions, but they're not probably related to codes. So it's
Okay.
just how you guys do some planning efforts in terms of what to protect and not to protect. Is it not-
Yeah, I know there's a whole lot of information.
It's
It
a-
just came
yes.
at you
It's not
really
real-
fast. If you think of questions later on, you could feel free to contact Dylan, I
Yep.
guess. And,
Or we have social pin.
Yeah, there's always a way to express your questions, concerns, after the meeting.
For the next steps for, please go ahead, Ms. Anderson.
I'm gonna go back to the wildlife corridors, because when I was saying wildlife corridors, I was thinking the county. When I was not saying the west and the north, but where are there wildlife corridors in the city?
So it is to the west as well, everything west of US 1 that's undeveloped, as well as, I have seen maps that include at a lower significant Graham Swamp as well.
What about the forested area along the large drainage ditch on Royal Palms? The hiking trail is and all that, is that considered a corridor?
I don't, not by the Florida Wildlife Corridor, but we are looking at local significant corridors. That is the thing that we spelled out comprehensive, I believe, to analyze all that as well, take it into consideration. Yeah, that's the thing.
It's outside Palm Coast.
But we have done, I believe, a fairly good job at keeping a lot of our conservation land so that we do have the ability to build where we, and of course, we're always working to try to add more conservation to that variety.
There's some of the things that you could do on these, along these drainage ditches, if you had, again, forested buffers along them, you would serve two purposes, one wildlife and the other very much so on the flooding control, because, these things really slow down stuff coming off of impervious surface and really helps, the water to percolate down into the ground, so.
Yes, sir.
And then understanding I was going to ask a question about how you do the flood control models and what the scale of the digital elevation model that you have. So I don't know whether they flew LiDAR here to get down to like the 30-centimeter level in a lot of coastal areas are doing that. Did you guys get that done, or was that done by the state?
So we do have LiDAR. We joined with St. John's River Water Management District. Our LiDAR was flown in 2017. So that is the most recent LiDAR we have. But all of the base flood elevations are determined by FEMA. So they do their own modeling, and then they give us the maps. So we have to regulate off their maps, but we do have our own LiDAR, so we can look at it when we're reviewing developments, make sure they have proper information. We'll give them our LiDAR. We did have a consultant a couple years ago do a citywide stormwater model that we also provide them to help with their modeling as well, to make sure that their calculations are correct.
Do the models include subsurface interactions? So, because Florida has at least 3 groundwater systems, and I'm wondering if the near surface, you integrate that in, because if you have that going, that can affect sort of what areas might be where you have those intrusions. You might get, if you're just looking at surface flow, you're not going to get the real picture on flooding, and I'm wondering if that's included in the model.
I can ask, that's more of an engineering question, and I can definitely ask our stormwater engineer if he's aware of that being utilized for for our own modeling. But I can definitely ask that. But going back earlier, you said for the drainage ditches being used as corridors, those might be a little bit difficult because with corridors, they usually want them to remain natural, and our drainage ditches in the city, we maintain, we either mow them or dredge them, we spray them for aquatic weeds.
Right, yep.
So those I wouldn't really deem as a corridor, because we do that maintenance on them, which wouldn't be in keeping with the natural aspect of the corridors.
Right. You do get a lot of wildlife species that use them and move along.
It's true.
Because we live, I'm sorry, we live on one off our property, and I'm amazed at what's in it. I mean, it's like water, 3 species of water snakes.
Absolutely.
Lots of shorebirds are in there feeding their small fish. I mean, it's, and then there's lots of, there's lots of canopy, so you get a lot of really cool nesting birds in there, so.
Yeah. I just worry that if we label it as a corridor, that might tie us up for any kind of maintenance activities that we may need to do there, as far as making sure the drainage is flowing, any kind of flood protection projects.
And we're lucky because our drainage just flows into a big forested wetland across the street that hasn't been developed.
There you go.
You know, so it's always emptying out, but you go into we're in the Z section, and you go in, up further north of us, and the streets just flood like crazy because there's no off-charge into an area where it dissipates energy like that, you know.
So that would be Black Branch Swamp, I believe?
I'm not sure what they call it, but it's a large area that goes all the way out to the one, and it's a big forest patch, and I
Yeah,
know it.
a lot of that is Black Branch Swamp. A lot of that is under conservation flume, if I believe. And there's quite a bit of it under conservation easement as well. So that will, unless they go to St. John's to get that easement either released or modified, a lot of that will stay very thick wetland back in. And that is almost entirely flood zone as well.
It's cool because you get a lot of stuff that's coming off of that and using the drainage ditch corridors, so you actually have some connectivity. It's kind of interesting, but it's not for everything, so it probably wouldn't come up to the grade of being a quality wetland or corridor, I'm sure, but you know, you are getting some benefit from it, and you're also getting some benefit from flood control because you have a way for the energy to dissipate coming off of the drainage ditches. And if you don't have those, a lot of developments, they're putting in those areas, detainment ditches for the water overflow, you know, but they don't have any real way to get out. And when you have a forested wetland like that, it's just amazing what it does, so.
Yeah, we actually installed a bunch of gauges all over the city where we can go out. We go out monthly and check the water elevation on there. We also go check it after we've had a very large rain event just to see how the waters interact with the different systems all over the city. So that's something new that stormwater departments installed recently. It's been quite interesting.
Yeah,
See the
'cause
different water levels.
it'd be a real challenge with the growth of the city because so much impervious surface is added, and you're taking out trees which break energy and funnel water into the ground, but you're putting in impervious surface, and it's just
Erosion
it
control
has
is
no
an
place
issue.
to go.
Right.
And you're not recharging the aquifer.
And you're not recharging the aquifer, exactly,
Less
yeah.
recharging the aquifer,
So
the more
it's-
water you need.
So it's a challenge when you see that, so I don't know. You know, but there's not much you can do since it's private land, so it's like,
Yeah, well, we do have, stormwater design regulations that require that, either the same amount or a lesser amount of runoff from that site, will be the case after the development is complete. So it's not like we just keep it paved up, let the water fly. We do contain it. There are some, water quality, water quality and quantity requirements. So that's all taken into account with every site plan. We have a stormwater engineer on our review team that looks at that. There's actually 2 of them that look at that on every project. So we are conscious of that, and we do design according to state regulations.
thanks for the information on that.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Very good.
All right. The next steps for us with this presentation in the Land Development Code, I'll include any changes and look into the couple things we discussed. And I will be bringing it to Planning Board, I believe in this. Well, thank you for letting me borrow your time and providing lots of feedback and good discussion on this chapter of the Land Development Code.
Yeah, appreciate you making the effort to get here and to participate in this discussion, because we need it, and we look forward to it from your committee and some other groups as well. Okay, at this time, we'll open it up for public comment, and we'll spin around and take a look and see who's here. Seeing no one, we'll close public comment. And,
There is one other thing. We have 2 meetings scheduled for BEAC in December. 12/4, we have part 2 of chapter 10. So that's something that I would ask, would we be in a position to move another chapter up and be able to inform the members tonight, or would we follow up with it?
covered it.
Yeah,
Tonight.
I mean, chapter 10, we finished.
So we're not going to move something, another chapter forward.
Not at this time.
Okay, so good news. No December meetings. Woo-hoo.
Yay.
It was the 4th, and they are posting, officially send you an email to all the members to let you know, but thank you for discussing that now.
Okay. Any other further questions or suggestions? If not, we can, I guess, adjourn the meeting.
Anybody?
We could make it a
Second.
motion. Yeah.
I'm sorry, we don't have a quorum.
With that, the meeting is adjourned.